Hello and welcome to Note Doctors. My name is Paul.
My name is Jenn.
My name is Ben.
And we are your hosts. We are all university music theory instructors who are passionate about music theory and music theory instruction. In this podcast, we will be talking about all things theory with some of the best music theory teachers in the country. If you want to know more about music theory and the most effective and innovative ways to teach it, this is the podcast for you. Hello and welcome back to Note Doctors, the music theory and pedagogy podcast. Well, we are excited once again to collaborate with JMTP. What's JMTP? Well, that is the Journal of Music Theory Pedagogy, which is the source. It is the peer-reviewed journal for the field of music theory pedagogy, and they have a new volume coming out in 2024, so we have the great opportunity to speak with one of the authors in the upcoming volume, Jennifer Shafer England, about her article, which I'm going to pull up right here. It's called One Bite at a Time, Writing in the Theory Classroom. It's a great article, and so this is going to be just something to whet your appetite, an amuse-bouche that will get you excited about reading this article when it comes out in 2024. But before we dive into this article, Jen, let's learn a little bit more about Dr. Shafer England.
Absolutely. So Jennifer Shafer England is an assistant professor at Montana State University, where she teaches various theory and oral skills courses and also coordinates the theory and oral curricula. Her research interests are mathematics and computation in music and music theory pedagogy. She's presented her work at various regional and national music theory and music theory pedagogy conferences, has published in and served on the editorial board of Engaging Students, and is on the editorial board for the resources section of the Journal of Music Theory Pedagogy. When not dreaming up new course designs, she will probably be in the kitchen baking or else drinking tea while reading a good book. I wish we had talked about that as well, because that sounds like me. It's such a good article, and the appendices are amazing. So stay tuned.
Not only that, but it also, in terms of building up to more independence in terms of writing and research and analysis, we want them to ask questions. We want them to listen to a piece, look at a piece, and then think about those more complicated questions. And so asking them to come up with questions, that's what we do. We look at a piece and we think about questions that we have about the piece, and then we try to figure out an answer to those questions. And so I like that idea too, just for prepping them for kind of more advanced processes.
So today our very special guest is Jennifer Shafer England. We're so happy to have you on, continuing our collaboration with JMTP and all the wonderful articles that they're coming out with. And so we're excited to talk with you about your upcoming article coming up in their latest edition and volume. So before we get into that, though, we always like to ask our guests a little bit about their background, how they got into music theory. Looking at your bio, you were born in Wyoming. You've studied in Texas, Kentucky, Ohio. You have then had a job in Delaware, and now you're in Montana. So did you really think that studying music theory would be this globe-trotting career?
I did not. First, thanks for having me. I'm really thrilled to be here. But no, I actually also had no intention of studying music theory when I went to school. That was not my plan. I grew up in a very small town in Wyoming. Like we have a 3-way stop sign, and we're very proud of that 3-way stop. The nearest stoplight is 100 miles from where I grew up. So that's the kind of place I grew up. So when I went to college, I was going to do a degree in piano. And then my plan was just to settle down wherever and teach piano in a home studio situation, and that was my plan. While I was there, I became the department's, it was a very small school, so the only theory tutor for the entire department, and found I really liked that. I knew I wanted to teach, but I didn't know that I was good at theory, I guess, until I got there. And so the idea of teaching the theory was kind of a new thing. And more importantly, my professors there were like, you have to go to grad school. You have to go to grad school. So decided that pretty late, as in missed most of the application deadlines for many universities, even by senior year. I had succumbed to the grad school plan but was going to go in piano. And then I was just like, no, this is not going to be the best fit. And my piano professor, who I really owe a lot to him for seeing this, he was like, no, you have to go in theory. You can't go in piano. You got to go in theory. And he was right. I would have, it was the right decision definitely to go in theory. So yeah, that's kind of how that happened. I'm kind of a math nerd in a lot of ways. So I had done a math minor, like just for the heck of it. And ended up doing a kind of undergrad thesis sort of honors project thing. Just because, and I did it in kind of an intersection of math and music stuff. And that was kind of my first introduction to like theory exists beyond Roman numerals. And so with that was another thing that I was just kind of like, I'm kind of curious what else is out there in this world of music theory, so to speak. And so that's what sent me eventually to Kentucky and then Ohio. And then, yeah, I was very fortunate to be hired kind of last minute for a job at University of Delaware, and went out there as like a part-time adjunct and ended up staying there for 6 years and was super excited to work with the theorists that were out there. And when a job came up kind of in home country a little bit, I was excited to take that. So
that's great. Yeah. Delaware, that's a hotbed for theory pedagogy. I mean, we've had number of people from Delaware on the show, and there's more that we want to talk to. And it's a surprising little gem there, right in the mid-Atlantic.
For sure. Those 6 years were huge for me, especially coming out of graduate school and working with, at the time, Phil Duker and Danny Stevens were the two main theory faculty there, and then Patricia Burt joined a couple years later, and it was a really special time when all four of us had converged there in our professional lives, and so so much of my teaching and my approaches to teaching to them. So very grateful for that chance at collaboration.
That's great. So we are talking with you about your article that is titled, I believe the title is still One Bite at a Time, Writing in the Theory Classroom. Is that right?
It is, yes.
All right, great. And so I love this paper and I love this topic because writing about theory is hard enough. And you mentioned that the very first sentence, writing about music in a theoretical way is hard for professionals, right? Let alone sophomore level or freshman level students. And so can you talk to us a little bit about how you kind of got into this? You have a great lit review where you kind of go through a lot of previous research on writing and different high stakes and low stakes writing projects and different types of prose. So can you talk to us a little bit about how you kind of got into this?
Sure. So I suppose as far as getting into the topic in general, when I went to Delaware, so first job out of grad school, I was really excited because I had kind of full freedom with the curriculum. As a TA, I was an instructor of record, but still had a lot of curricular elements that were kind of put in place to support us, which was great. But I was like, oh, I can do whatever I want now. I mean, not really, but and so. But the folks at Delaware very much were supportive of that. The Theory 2 was my classroom, and I could more or less do what I wanted. And I, with a lot of support from them, I definitely asked many questions of them my first year. But so one thing I had said, and I think I discussed this a little bit in the beginning of the paper, is that I felt like my undergraduate, I didn't write about music very much until I started doing like that undergrad thesis kind of project, and didn't have really a sense of how to go about it in a way. And so probably partly because I was reading other literature and so forth, I kind of started to get a sense of how to do that. But I wouldn't say it was a particularly smooth process. And so I had thought that I would really love to have students write about music earlier in their careers, as early as possible, but also to make it not be the thing where it's the last project you turn in and it's usually rushed because it's finals week and everybody's tired and everybody's playing juries and we are tired as faculty also. And students may not even read the comments that you leave on a final paper, or come pick it up the next semester if it was a hard copy. And so I just wanted to try to find a way to have that entrance into writing about music, but have it be more manageable than that, and also have it be something that we repeated. So we didn't just do it once, and that was it. We would actually learn from it and keep going. So the literature I found on this, I would say a number of other people in the field have had trends going in the same direction. I didn't read a lot on it before I started, which probably I should have before I started designing my project. But there's certainly, I think, a trend away from what we call the, in quotes, the traditional term paper, for all the reasons that we just talked about. And so there's a definite movement away from that. There's a definite movement towards stringing it throughout the theory core and not just waiting till you get to upper level form class to try to write about music, because it is hard and it takes practice and it takes some skills to do that. There's a lot of people who are doing various forms of scaffolding, whether that's turning in drafts, whether it's writing an outline first, whether it's helping students come up with sort of questions that they're going to approach the paper with, any of those sort of things to kind of break it down, bite-sized, to use the term I use in my paper. And then also a lot of talk about actually presenting models of how to write about music, because that's often something, it's not, we read lots of these academic-y papers about music and you learn style and tone from doing that, but that's not the case for most of our undergraduates. And so presenting models for them just on good writing, period, and then on writing about music so that they can kind of see how it's done. And several people do some version of that. I do that as well, and it was really helpful to do that the second time that I used these papers.
Yeah, it's funny that you said you wish that you had read all of these things before you designed the project, because as I was reading your article, I have a writing assignment right now in my Theory 1 class. They could choose between composing something and writing a little paper or creating a video or podcast.
Oh, cool.
And so it's been really interesting to see who went which direction and all of those things. But as I was reading your article, I was like, I have so many regrets. There's so many things I wish I had done differently, but it is scaffolded. They turn 4 different stages in. They're about to turn in stage 3, which is kind of the draft version of the whole thing. Cool. But some of their compositions already are really spectacular, and some of them already have a pretty good sense for how to write about music, minus the part where a lot of it is very it's so beautiful. It's so wonderful. This chord is really great. Things like that. So we're working on it.
At one point, I would have to think now if I could come up with some words, but I was like, there are some words that I'm going to outlaw in papers, because they tend to be the kind of filler words that don't really get at the substance of it, and you could apply it to any piece of music. So I've not actually taken that step, but it is interesting how easily students will kind of fall into the same lingo across different papers for that reason.
Okay, and I really related to this article, and I wish I would have read it sooner, because as I was going down your first, I will say 10 or so pages, I had realized that I had experienced all of these things the hard way, which is basically not asking them to submit a draft. Always assigning it at the end of the semester, right? Yeah. Only doing it maybe in Theory 2 and not doing it in Theory 1. And, and I really, really like your approach of not pinpointing it to one specific spot, and maybe also giving them help along the way. Because I, have these, and maybe some of you out there listening will relate to this. You always have this grand kind of vision for what your students will write in response to a certain essay prompt. My opening question was describe what timbres you use and how that epitomized the character that you are writing about, and I had this picture of Mr. Incredible going by, and the brass was playing and the percussion was for this fast motion, and then the next person did this thing with just a little fairy that was the tiniest thing, and it was just a let's say a slight touch of the wind chime, or something. And that was the answer that I had in my head, and the answer that I actually got back was it was a trombone, because I like the sound of the trombone. That was the full answer of the whole prompt. It was one sentence. And I thought, That is not what I had in mind, and I didn't have him submit a draft or anything. That was just like the final submission. So then, as I go back to do it again, I gave an example of, okay, for a heavier person, you might think of a heavier quality thing. Or I tried to give an example of if it's flying or leaping upward, it might be a melodic line that has a farther distance to cover. And I tried to give examples or things that they might include in their written responses, and then obviously have a draft due, and all these things that have come up in your paper. But yeah, thank you for outlining that at the beginning, because I think those people that are starting out and they want to do something like this, they will very much appreciate knowing that on the front end and not having to live through it, because I definitely have lived through that in the last 3 to 4 years, I will say. So thank you for that.
I'm glad it looks like it'll be useful. It's definitely, I've learned trial by fire too. Just because I'm writing the article doesn't mean I didn't do various things that I would never do again, for sure. But even the peer review component I write about in the paper just changed so much about my students' writing, and I don't 100% know why in terms of it. If it's just it's not I've heard some people call the audience of one, where they're just writing to you specifically as the instructor, and they're writing something they know their peers are going to read. Or whether it's just the fact that they know they have to do it before the night before it's due. So they have to actually do it and turn it in first. Any of the above, I don't know. But anxieties went down a lot too with peer review and with looking at models. They seem to be much more confident about it, even if they didn't really change much from the peer review to the final draft, because they felt like they were okay. So that helped with that too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's great. So could you talk to us a little bit about the two projects that you kind of outline and discuss in your paper that are both relatively low stakes and not very large in size? So can you talk to us about that?
Sure. So the first project, and it takes up I would say a larger chunk of the paper, is writing short analytical papers. And so this was my pet project when I first started it, which I wanted to have them write analytical, putting quotes around that again, because it's not like this big analysis paper. They're 1 to 2 pages long. They're responding to prompts that I give them. But the thing I wanted to focus on was getting them to focus on the writing. So before we did one of these, we had, usually it was on a Friday, so I called it Analysis Friday, in class. And oftentimes we'd led up to that with some prep for it. But on that day, they would work in small groups, and it was their job to do all of the analysis steps that I had laid out for them by the time the class period ended. But then once they'd finished that, their task over basically the weekend and the first part of the following week was to write a paper with the analysis work that they'd done. So the idea would be you have all the data, for lack of a better word, and you're just writing now. So they're not going to have to agonize over, I don't know what's going on in measure 6, I just don't know what it is, and that seems important, but I don't know what to do with it. They've already got all the answers. And so that let me really customize what we were doing. So if I had the whole class, or even just a couple groups that were slow getting through the analysis, I would just give them a key at the end of it with all the answers. Because I wanted them to do the analysis, I wanted them to work through that, but then I wanted the writing to be about the writing and not about whether they also knew how to analyze, so that I could, as much as I could, kind of separate those two skills. And then they have a choice of prompts, so there'd usually be usually at least 3 prompts, and they would be asked to respond to 2 of them, oftentimes 4 to 5 prompts. Something, the prompts would vary to something more kind of, I don't know, objective, I guess, like describe the form of this piece, talk about where the phrases and cadences are, how do motives intertwine with that or not. And then there would often be something that was a little bit more open-ended, like, why are these 2 textures alternating in this excerpt? Why do you think the composer would do that? So that they're, at that point, truly theorizing about why the composer did that. We don't really know. But trying to get them to think a little bit more creatively. And then I try to usually have something that was even more what they would probably perceive as less theoretical. So go listen to 5 performances of this piece, talk about differences that you hear in the performances and what that may or may not have to do with some of what you learned about the piece. Or I had one for one of the art songs I did where I said, just imagine that you heard this piece and you didn't know what the text was about. How would you use this piece in a film? What mood does it evoke? What pictures does it give you in your mind, and why? And so then they could really step away from some of the more sticky parts of analysis and just talk about what they were hearing and the sort of meaning in the piece in that way. So that was one of them.
Okay, I have all sorts of questions about even
Sure,
this first one. I love it. I love how you gave them the answers because I think it's getting at like, what is this assessment about? Sometimes we have these assessments where it's like all this stuff, right? It's you got to theorize, you got to get the right answers, and you have to write about it. And what is your outcome? Your outcome in this with this assessment or this assignment is on the writing, right?
Yeah.
You have other types of projects or assessments, things like that, where you can see how well they're analyzing, right? And
Right.
I think frees up the students a little bit, and also I think it gives I would imagine it gives you a lot more direction on and knowing what you're really assessing and what's going on.
Yeah, it definitely does. I feel like that's another reason they felt more confident in terms of like, okay, I have to write a paper, but at least I know what I'm writing about. And then I still assess that. Like, I still assess the content of their paper. One of the things on my rubric is like accuracy. And so if they are saying things that's not correct about the analysis, I will, in fact, probably grade a little harder on that part of the rubric in some sense because you had the answers.
Right.
And so I want them to take what's used in class and make sure that they're really taking that piece of it and applying it. And I didn't usually have a lot of issues with that. But if students weren't sort of drawing from class, they would tend to correct that pretty quickly, realizing that like, oh, yeah, I actually did know where all the cadences were, and I should have just looked at my class notes. So they were pretty quick to adjust to that. But it definitely helped me when grading to just focus on the writing part of it.
And with those different types of prompts, some very analytical or descriptive, others much more interpretive. Did you find that certain types of students maybe flock to different types of questions? Did students who are maybe weaker in theory generally choose topics that were less detailed, or did you find any patterns or habits from doing that?
Yeah, it did depend a little bit. I would say probably the ones who were less analytically minded or who enjoyed some of the nuts and bolts of it less would be more likely to pick one of the more open-ended ones. But I would say usually they had to pick two. They wrote a 2-page paper, so it's like 1 page each prompt, more or less. I didn't require them to do that way, but that's generally how it would average out. I would say pretty frequently everybody would pick one of the more sort of analytical designed ones because they had the answers to that. So if they had to go look up the performances, that does take some extra work on that part because we would listen to it in class, but we didn't listen to 5 different performances of it. And so I think there certainly were students who would do that sort of prompt. And I would say sometimes it was the students who were maybe theory wasn't their favorite class, but I think it was also students who were more, that were in the like bachelor music degree, like they were more interested in performance. And so I think that showed a little bit too. I did occasionally have students who would see maybe some intersections between topics. And so then they might tend to pick like 2 topics that kind of intersected a little bit so they could kind of weave together a little bit more complex paper. That didn't happen a lot, and I didn't expect it or necessarily want it to because I didn't want them to that would take a little more effort than I was actually wanting them to put into these. But it did occasionally happen.
Jennifer, can you talk a little bit more about, and this is, I guess, tangential to Paul's point, about the scaffolding and how your students kind of responded to that? Because, you have this stage where, okay, we try the analysis and you give them the answers, then we start on the writing. And I mean, from what I've found, the writing, to have some feedback time on the writing, you will see some growth there.
Sure. I would say 2 things come to mind. Number one, I think they were still intimidated initially, in terms of like, all right, I know how to put Roman numerals on a piece of paper, but I now have to like talk about them using words. And that is a kind of intimidating thing to think about. So the year that I implemented something where I gave them fake papers to grade, like I wrote these mock papers and gave them to them.
Which are really amazing. There's 3 of them in the paper, and I love them.
Yeah.
I'm not going to lie. That was so fun to write those because I was just like, they are actual, like these are things that I've seen, but they are certainly a little bit caricatured also in terms of like some of the types of mistakes or style things that students tend to do that we want to avoid. But what was interesting about that was they had so much fun grading those papers. I had them for like a homework. They had to read them and grade them. And the things that they wrote on the papers, they were like mock grading as if they were the teacher. I remember somebody wrote something like, "Holy run-on sentence, Batman," like in the margin of one of the papers. So I think that in terms of scaffolding, like they had the answers, but they'd also seen some examples of both bad and fairly good. I gave them one paper that was clearly a little better than the other 2. And I think that actually was probably the most important piece of scaffolding in terms of setting it up. And I definitely also saw from beginning to end of semester, because I always did with these papers, I always did at least 3 of them. I think the first year I taught I did 4, and then I did 3 the next year, part because of the peer review, it needed more space. They grew incredibly in terms of kind of their confidence with what they were doing, just in terms of like their actual wordsmithing, but also their sense of, I don't know, almost just having kind of turns of phrase that they could use and they could apply. And I think that also came from reading other people's papers. So they'd not only seen my models, but then in peer review, they saw 3-ish other people's papers every time we did this. And so, and I mixed up the groups so they didn't keep seeing each other's writing styles. They kept seeing different people. And so I think that kind of exposure factor helped a lot. Most students don't love this project initially, but I've had a number of students with the analytical papers. By the end, they're like, yeah, that actually was useful. It made me really think about how to communicate about this, and they can see the usefulness of it. I don't think most of them, unless they already are inclined towards writing, I wouldn't say that they're like, this was the best assignment ever, but they at least feel a little bit more neutral about it, and convinced of the usefulness of it. And I'm okay with that. I would like for them to actually enjoy it, but I'm okay with it if they can feel neutral and see it being useful.
Yeah. Does your LMS allow for the peer review setup, or did you kind of set that up on your own?
It does kind of. I used Canvas for that. The school I was using at used Canvas at the time. I didn't actually use the peer review function as much. I did like groups. So they had their own little group page kind of where they then posted to. I think it actually has quite a bit more advanced peer review stuff you can use. I didn't use it at the time. You can also, if you do that, there are ways to make it purely anonymous too. So in Canvas anyway, which I never did. So there would be other options for how to do that, and could completely randomize peer review if you wanted to do it that way as well. I wanted to organize the groups a little bit myself, in terms of kind of trying to mix different strengths and weaknesses in a group. So that was why I did it that way.
Yeah, that's great. Could you talk about the journal assignment or assignments?
Sure, yeah. So that was my second project that I implemented, and is kind of the second half of the article. When I'd run the analytical papers for a few years, it was largely pleased with the results of it, but I had gotten to a point where I was like, I don't want just 3, like I want more of this.
You want more grading.
I want more grading, yeah, exactly.
We'll talk about that later.
But I also, so at the same time, this was not necessarily to do with the writing piece of it, but I had also decided I wanted to bring in their ensemble repertoire into class, and have them do analysis with that, which is great. That's wonderful. I think it is anyway, but in terms of relevance factor. But those were not going to be pieces I was going to have them analyze in a 15-minute class period and then write about. And so my curriculum was going to get too crunched if I tried to like do that and do these little analysis days. So that combined with feeling like I wanted them to do more writing made me, I kind of stepped back and was like, all right, we're going to do more writing, but we're going to do smaller pieces of it. And that was how the journal articles came to be. Some similar elements in the sense that there's always 2 to 3 prompts they can choose from. And even similar in the sense there's usually one that was kind of heavily content based, like tell me how, or write out the steps for how you would write a 5/7 of X chord. What would be the steps you would need to be able to do this, to spell it correctly, and blah, blah, blah. And then maybe another one that's like, we did this listening based exercise in class on Wednesday. How did it go? What did you hear? How did your hearing develop across the course of the class period, or something like that? And then oftentimes something that would be more sort of self-reflective over recent class material. So they still had choices. They still had some mixture of like kind of content objective based stuff, and then some that were more reflective or kind of interpretive in nature. So these were due every week. They could skip some. They didn't have to do them all. But if they did do them all, they could earn like a little bit of extra credit. And they could also revise them. So no peer feedback, no peer element to this, but they were much shorter. And as far as grading goes, I will go ahead and say, like, I pretty quickly got to the point where I actually set like a 1-minute timer. And that was as much time on average. I certainly went a little longer sometimes. That was as much time as I would take to read, give feedback, and move on. Grading them pass fail obviously speeds things up because it's either pass or not pass, but that helped me to kind of like contextualize the amount of space that I could give these because they were every week, which is certainly can be a lot to keep up with. So these ones, the student responses, I would say they generally liked these better than the student papers, the analytical papers. I think they saw the immediate application of them a little bit more than the analytical paper side of things. And so I really actually liked the journal articles, I would say, better in the end than the papers, partly also because this was still a Theory 2 class. And so I think some of the paper writing extending into other semesters could have been more effective too.
And it's also kind of nice how you're able to assess their learning with some of those prompts, like, you know, spell a 5/7 of 5 in the, or explain how you construct a 5/7 of 5 in E flat major, or talk to me about how your experience with that in class project went, because so often you get the feedback from the students who are the loudest and seem to get it. You know, I have right now in my Oral Skills 3 class, I have like a row that just gets everything like almost instantaneously. Mm-hmm. And they're always raising their hand. They always have things to say. They always, and if you just focus on them, you're like, boy, things are going great. But there's another, 12 people in that room. Yep. And so I like how this also kind of peels back the curtain, and students can be honest and tell how they're feeling. So if you have students who are, not getting it, you can see that.
Yeah. Yeah, I was surprised in some ways how much the content-based questions revealed to me about how things were going in the class. And something that I find useful as a teacher too is it revealed it way quicker, because this was like, 3 weeks before we would have an exam on applied chords, or before they'd even turned in much of a homework on applied chords. And I was like, oh, like 5 students filled this out or picked this question, and 3 of the 5 have this problem. That's really good to know right now. And we'll talk about it on Monday. So, things like that could happen. And then also I think I can remember one student in particular, great student. She was super excited. She was always super eager to learn. But she definitely, the sort of detail-oriented aspect wasn't kind of her default. And I felt like we went back and forth like 4 times on, I think it was applied chords actually. And by the time we had done that, and it doesn't take me very long to go in and see, oh, there's a new submission and so resubmitted this. By the time we had done that, I knew that she had ironed out all of the details with applied chords in a way that she was probably going to remember better even than if we had sat down in office hours and talked through it. Because with the kind of like back and forth through the LMS in that case, she had worked through it more independently than if we had sat down and done it together. And so it's kind of interesting how those opportunities showed up even in ways that I didn't really expect.
I just really appreciated your article because I think teaching writing is so important. And it's the thing that when I got to graduate school, I felt the least prepared in. Like I understood things. I felt capable of, getting through the classes. But when it came to writing, I was like, writing about music is really hard. And analytical writing is really hard. And I hadn't done that much of it. Maybe if any, I don't know, maybe like one paper in a form class or something,
Yeah.
And then music history papers, which are kind of different than analytical writing. And so I've always valued it, and I've always tried to include it in my curriculum and teach it. But I often find it sort of like how my oral skills teacher taught us to do harmonic dictation was, well, it's a 4-chord. Can't you hear that? It's a 4-chord. That's how I have often felt teaching writing to, because it's sort of like, well, you shouldn't talk about what the composer intended to do because you don't know. And, stop referencing the audience so much. You have no idea if they are going to feel like it swoons across whatever, You talk about the music, reference the music. And then when they do that, it gets really like the G goes to A flat. And then the A flat goes to B flat. But then in a twist, B flat goes to F. Like, no, I didn't want that either, So
You had me on the edge of my seat, Jen.
right?
I was expecting to be natural to show up. That's what
I was too, actually.
So I just really, like, as I was reading through, I just felt re-energized. Like, there are things I really want to try next semester. I'm probably not going to do the same sort of project model. This is the first time I've ever tried it in Theory 1. I think it's been good, but I'm probably not going to do the same thing in Theory 2. And so I really liked the journal idea, just because, I don't know, like you said, it's this sort of regular feedback. And now that I know that you can grade most of them within about a minute, that's comforting. My classes are small enough that means it will not take me that long. So that's also good to know. So.
Yeah, thanks. I'd be curious to hear more about your experience also with the project with like the choices students are making too. But I've didn't write about them in the article. I've done a couple other writing based things. And they tended more towards the journal side of things. Just in terms of length and also depth of content to some degree. There's certainly less depth there than in the analytical papers. But I've felt like they met my students more where they were ready to be in those particular cases. And so I think that's an important aspect, too, of how to set up something like this and how to make it something they can accomplish.
Yeah, that's really good.
I've kind of, as I mentioned earlier, I've kind of evolved different kinds of projects that involve written prompts before. I've never done anything too long. Maybe I would say 2 to 3 sentences at a time for like Theory 1 or something like that, right? But I am curious as to how you've kind of revised your projects over the years, and what have you kind of learned from that? Because, as I said earlier, I'm willing to try things, and then I discover after failing or getting the answer of, I just like the trombone, which is fine, but like, what can you tell us as far as what you've learned that now in this iteration, I really made a breakthrough on X, Y, or Z,
Sure. I think some amount of that has been learning that I have to decide kind of which is not to say that you haven't, but to decide what my actual goal is for the students. So if it's to like write analytically, then I want to set them up with like analysis that's already, they have some confidence about what it is that they're going to do, at least initially, and then could gradually drop that scaffolding away. Particularly, I ended up both at UD and now at MSU. I happen to be teaching a lot of freshman level classes. And so I, to some extent, that's not a goal that I've taken quite as strongly in terms of like being able to write analytically, but just being able to communicate about music in any way, shape, or form has been more the tendency that I have headed towards. Because that's still hard. Like, it's not, you don't have to be talking about like formal analytical things, and it's still tough to write about music. It's tough to kind of try to encapsulate this art form into a written text that's kind of frozen in time, like it's a fixed experience, as opposed to music, which we often think of as being more happening in real time. And so I would say I've kind of revised some of my instincts of the communication angle being important versus the like language angle, I guess. And I still think there's definitely room for the language angle to be something that we would want to pursue. But for the classes that I'm teaching right now and the student population that I'm teaching right now, I have not pursued that as much. And so I would say most of the writing that I assign at this point is more, I would call it informal writing. But the sort of trade-off for that is that I do ask students to be very clear with what they're communicating in terms of using words we've used in class, using terms that we've learned, using language correctly, but that it doesn't have to be formal speak, so to speak. I don't know if you're familiar with Angela Ripley's postcards, Post-Tonal Postcards article from JMTP a few years ago. I reference it in this article as well, but sort of that sense of, you know, you can be writing literally a postcard is kind of the setup of it. You're writing a postcard about a piece, but with a specific audience, and the audience could be like a freshman music student who's not taken Theory 3 or Theory 4 at this point. So obviously you have to think about what language is appropriate for them, and it's probably not going to be academic article speak, or hopefully not anyway. But you can still communicate things about the music to them. And so I've definitely tended more that direction with every assignment that I've done, partly because I've mostly taught freshman level or first year level classes of late. And I think that's been more useful for students to kind of grapple with. As I continue teaching through the curriculum here at MSU and move into some higher upper level classes, I would like to bring back in some more of the slightly more formal writing. But I think it's also important to think about, you know, what your students are going to use it for. Program notes, they probably don't need to be talking about whether it's a half cadence or PAC, and whether there's this really nice applied dominant that happens in measure 7. But they might actually need to write program notes, but that's not how they're going to write them. And so those sorts of things, I've started to think more about ways to make sure that they see the assignment as something that's going to help them with their career goals too.
I'm just imagining the postcard assignment and like how like Adorno would never be able to complete that assignment or something. It'd just be like this accordion postcard, just keep on going. And it's just like one sentence.
Yeah.
So anyway, that's a real deep cut there with musicology there. Adorno reference. So could you let us know a little bit about your favorite writing prompt? So you've had to generate a lot clearly over numerous semesters, things like that. But have you found one or two prompts that maybe got students excited more than others, or maybe evoked particularly interesting responses?
Sure. Various open-ended ones. I mean, you know, why are we surprised the one about cadence and some forms doesn't create the most like exciting response? But no, some of the more creative ones, like theorizing why the composer alternates these textures. Or I did actually ask one once, which certainly did not generate a 2-page paper, but I asked them what prompt they wish they'd been asked, basically. So write your own prompt for this piece based on the analysis work that you did. That one was super fun. Obviously, shorter papers from that. They didn't have to write a whole page-long prompt. But it was really interesting to see, because it obviously couldn't be anything like the prompts that I had already given them. And so it was really interesting to see what the students were thinking about with the music that I hadn't thought to ask about. Because it wasn't necessarily like I felt like I had been comprehensive in my prompts. But it was really interesting to see some really kind of cool things that they thought were interesting there. So a lot of the things with the papers project, a lot of the things that were more open-ended or interpretive like that were really interesting to see how they approached that. I did ruin Haydn or Russline for somebody, though, because they didn't realize the implications of that text, unfortunately, and then they did. So
Oh no.
yeah, unfortunately. So on the journal side, I would say the content-based ones actually I think were the most valuable for a number of reasons. I think like all the things we talked about, kind of the feedback loop that happens there. Those are kind of they're the low-hanging fruit in some ways because, again, it's like should be things you know from class. But it was really helpful to see if they knew it or not, and for them to see that too. So I would say for the journals, actually, a lot of the kind of more lower level ones were my favorites.
Those types of questions or prompts make them be theorists, right? And actually theorize. You've mentioned this a few times where they're having to theorize, and that's showing those students what really we're supposed to be doing, right? We don't just go, you don't go to SMT or these regional conferences and just spell chords. You know, you don't do Roman numerals or realize figured bass all day. That's not what theory is. You know, theory is asking these really interesting questions that don't have clear answers oftentimes. And it's also cool to think about, like, if you're having them come up with their own prompts, is that they're using their own experience and their own observations to come up with a potentially good question, right? I can imagine it making students feel like their opinions and thoughts about music matter because, you know, that you're taking them seriously, right?
Right.
Yeah.
I think not only that, but it also, you know, in terms of building up to more independence in terms of writing and research and analysis, we want them to ask questions. Like, we want them to listen to a piece, look at a piece, and then think about those more complicated questions. And so asking them to come up with questions, that's what we do. We look at a piece and we think about questions that we have about the piece, and then we try to figure out an answer to those questions. And so I like that idea too, just for prepping them for kind of more advanced processes.
Yeah.
Well, this has been super fun, Jennifer, to chat with you about your article. And I really hope you listeners check out this article when it comes out in the latest edition or volume of JMTP in 2024. But before we let you go, we always like to do a little rapid fire question. And I think Ben had to go pick up Lucas, so he may not be asking a rapid fire question. But Jen, do you have a question?
I don't have one yet. I've got one. So what is your favorite piece of music that you have used for one of the analysis essay questions?
Probably the Schubert B-flat, the theme to the Schubert B-flat theme and variation set. It's short, it's lovely. I used it before. We actually do applied chords, but then we can like circle back to it. And I'm like, see this chord that I told you to skip? Now you know what it is. So it's just a nice short piece, and they get it. It's just fun.
That's a good one.
Great. Okay. Your favorite lesson that you've had this semester in any of the classes that you're teaching, but what's been your favorite class day or maybe lesson that you've had?
Lesson I taught or a lesson I learned?
Ooh, it could be both, right? Maybe a lesson that you learned about the lesson you taught. I don't know.
Oh, wow. Okay. Rapid fire, huh? I think so. If you're familiar with the guide-tone method that Daniel Stevens uses for harmonic listening, so I've been introducing that here and seeing the students like kind of when we were like getting to like some of the ins and they're like, oh yeah, I get this, I can do this, which was so not my experience with harmonic listening as an undergraduate. So it makes me so excited when that happens. Yeah, it's good. And if I can go with lesson I learned, I also make them do ostinato singing. Like over improv over an ostinato. So they're singing like a tonic ostinato, and then somebody in the group improvises just kind of a simple melody over the top. And I've done that before. It wasn't new, but this one particular student I have he's always super engaged. He's always super into things, but just watching him completely get lost in that. He's like got his eyes closed as he's conducting, and he's kind of like dancing as he's singing. And I was like, oh, this like improv thing doesn't have to be so stressful. And like, it wasn't even that it was, he didn't have experience with it. Like, it wasn't necessarily something that came naturally to him. Like, it wasn't that he was just like flowing through it, but it was just nice watching a student having that much fun with something that can be a little tough to get them to engage in. And then watching like how that affected the rest of his group as he's like having such an experience with it. So that was exciting.
Oh, I love that. I'm doing improv for the first time this semester in my Oral Skills 1. And it's like, it's great. They tend to enjoy it. Not when I announce we're going to do it, but then when it's over, they're like, that was actually fun. And someone says that pretty much every time. So, because it's low stakes, I don't grade them on it. Like, everybody goes, you can go for as long as you need to until you meet the objective. So yeah, it ends up being good. They cheer each other on, you know, all of that. So
yeah, awesome. Yeah, that's been my experience too. Like, usually when I demonstrate it, they're all looking at me like, are you serious? You want us to do that? But like, once I tell them we're going to just channel Nike, we're going to just do it. Like, just try it. And I just want you to end on do. Like, that's it. Just sing a scale and come back to do. And that's all you have to do. And once they do that, like, they'll kind of go with it, and they'll get a little more experimental and go with it. So yeah.
That's great. That's awesome. So as we're wrapping up, maybe you can let our listeners know how they can find you if you want to be found on the internet, if they have any questions for you, and then what you currently have in the works.
Sure. So have in the works as far as...
It could be your other research or maybe teaching or any number of things. Sure.
So you can find me at Montana State University. You can find my faculty webpage, which I'm pretty sure has my email, but it's jennifer.england, England like the country, and then the number 2 at montana.edu, but I'm pretty sure that's also available online. In the works, I have, actually, if I could do like short commercial, is that okay?
Oh, go for it. Absolutely.
I am thrilled to be chairing the program committee for the Pedagogy into Practice conference that will be happening at the very end of May, beginning of June in 2024. And so I'm super excited about that. We have a call for proposals out right now. And I'm really excited about being able to help put that program together. It's a conference that I love, just in terms of kind of the community that conference attracts, of people that are super excited about all things theory pedagogy. And so that's kind of big thing on my docket for the moment. And then my other thing is chasing alternative grading schemes. And I have a presentation I'll be giving at a Science of Teaching and Learning conference coming up soon on some alternative grading in Theory 1 in that case.
You just made it to the end of another episode of Note Doctors, the music theory and pedagogy podcast. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and review the podcast, and you can always reach us at notedoctorspodcast@gmail.com with comments, questions, or show ideas. Thanks for listening.